So good morning. Not quite morning, I guess good afternoon. My name is Peter Klenk, and I am a product manager at IBM. And I wanted to talk today about a few things. First, how IBM internally has been transforming and what we're doing with clients to transform to be able to deliver and compete in the current hyper-competitive, fast-paced, cloud-centric world. I'm going to talk about IBM's participation in open source, something we do a lot of, and I don't think we necessarily get the visibility for that from a lot of people out in the market. And then last, I'm going to talk about how that way of transforming and working and that involvement in open source are going to come together in the kind of cloud solutions IBM is delivering. So I think we all know this is a very disruptive world. You know, I joke that, Uber is now a verb, and it's a verb with two meanings, right? I Ubered over here this morning, but when we talk to CIOs and even CEOs of enterprises, they're worried about being Ubered, with a very different meaning. A competitor out of nowhere, using software, using the cloud, using mobility, using analytics, using cognitive computing, using Internet of Things, using some of these technologies that are at their disposal now to enter a market completely unseen. It's a stealth attack. It's not like there's a massive ramp-up of infrastructure to be able to deliver these disruptive applications. So the question we get is, how does the traditional enterprise address this disruption and get ahead of it? And how do we lead that kind of change in our organizations? And I think it starts with the developer. It's the developers who are going to create those new applications that are going to figure out innovative ways of leveraging those services. And so leading a digital transformation in the enterprise is really about empowering the developer. And I think there are a couple ways to look at that. One is the kind of culture you establish in the organization. Another is the kind of communities you create in your organization, but also the kind of communities you participate in outside your organization. And that's where open source and proprietary development, start to blend a lot, is when you get into the community aspect of things. And then third is code. What are we building? What does that code look like? What are we choosing for our platforms and our infrastructure, and how are we connecting it? Novel, I have slides. IBM has some history with disruption, by the way. I think many of you probably think of us as the mainframe company. In the mainframe generation, I think people thought of us as the typewriter company. So, even though, IBM might not be perceived as the leading cloud-native forefront of change, the fact is we've been able to do this over many generations of technology. All right, so here's where we were. So how do we create a culture in the enterprise for innovation for the developers? And I think, in the enterprise, there are always a lot of excuses. And I'm going to say there are excuses, because this is not optional. If you're going to be competitive in the market, you need to deliver faster. You need to leverage new technologies. The processes that are set up aren't catered to this. The organizational structures that are set up aren't catered to this. Typical enterprises are very hierarchical. Functions are divided very much by silo. There's the ops team, there's the dev team, there's the QA team, there's the business analyst team that does something that occasionally tells development what they need to do, but not on a continuous basis. And this is counter to how you're going to move quickly and experiment. A lot of industries are highly regulated. Healthcare, financial services. And so that imposes a burden on process, on verification, on separation of duties, that it's kind of neglected when you read the literature of what the folks at Etsy or the folks at Netflix are doing with cloud and DevOps. But it doesn't mean you can't address those needs in a fast-moving environment. It just means it takes some care. The kind of architectures and systems that we've built traditionally aren't amenable to fast delivery and disruption. They're often large monolithic applications running on specialized dedicated hardware. If you look at some of the cloud-native practices for zero downtime deployment. How do you pull that off? Well, app's up and running, you bring up the new version, you gradually shift traffic over to it. That's great, but it assumes you have an architecture where you can have multiple instances, and that the application logic is separate from the data tier. That's not true in a lot of enterprise applications. So what you have today isn't necessarily what's going to move quickly in the future. Now, IBM's pretty big. We've got a lot of developers. You can say we had a lot of siloed teams. We had very discrete lines of business. And we've been deliberately trying to execute a change over the last several years. We've reorganized into smaller squads, kind of following the Spotify nomenclature around squads. And we talk about 2 pizza teams now, kind of unheard of in the old IBM where organizations were measured in hundreds of people. That means they're obviously building some more granular stuff. So a microservice architecture almost emerges from this cultural pattern because 6 to 12 people can't build 1 million lines of code in a couple months. So that's a nice benefit. We've broken the silos down and combined QA and ops responsibilities into the dev team. And it's eye-opening for developers the first time they have to write an automated test for a web UI and they only can rely on XPath because they didn't think to put in unique IDs for various UI elements. Something the QA team has been arguing about and arguing for a decade, but never happened. Now that the developers understand and feel the pain, it's happening. Eye-opening when developers get an alert through PagerDuty that a runtime service in production is down. And so, just that organizational dimension has forced a huge amount of change into the way people act and behave and think about what's important when they're writing code. And the reality is it's not just the code they're writing, but it's thinking ahead to what is coming. Move to more of a Kanban process and continuous delivery. A decade ago, maybe a little more, IBM was doing an agile transformation. And we saw this in a lot of enterprises. Agile was the big thing. And I could argue it either way. It succeeded in that our development teams started doing continuous integration. They started doing daily stand-ups and increasing communication within their team. So that was all great. But it didn't actually solve the problem, because that's not where the bottleneck was. Right? The bottleneck was how do you get that code out of the development team? How do you get it tested and get it into production? And that continuous delivery mindset wasn't there when we embarked on Agile a decade ago and when a lot of others didn't. So I think that's a real difference in mindset in this transformation, and one that's actually getting the results we want, which is faster code into market, to innovate, to at least experiment and see what is going to be successful for our applications. We started embracing tools like Slack. I'm sure a lot of people here use similar tools for real-time collaboration. And again, all the stakeholders are listening on the same channels, and we've integrated it with our systems. So operations issues, test issues, build issues, all are automatically getting fed into that channel. So there's a tremendous increase in real-time awareness of what's going on with the project. So how did we go about that transformation? The executives sponsored it early on and established a center of competency within IBM. And they didn't build this by bringing in outside experts. They didn't build this by bringing in necessarily people who have done other things that were interesting in the past. They looked around IBM and found the teams that were breaking out of the mold and were doing better. And we brought the leaders of those teams and the practitioners from those teams into the center of competency where they could do boot camps and go out on site with other teams and walk them through how they work and how they can improve where they work. We established some core tools, GitHub Enterprise being one of them and probably being the first one we standardized on as the platform for coding. And by having one GitHub Enterprise repository across the organization, we had the ability to share code more widely. Now, it's taken, I'll say, about a year for teams to see the power in that. I'd say you look a year ago, you look 6 months ago, all the repos were private within our GitHub Enterprise instance. And what we've learned is, as teams were getting requests for, hey, do you have some code that does this? Or we also lifted the chains on teams to let them choose their own languages and their own architecture. So we got a much more polyglot world now. And so now, things that there used to be, maybe common blessed code for, well, no one's written that code in Python yet, or in or for Node yet. So now there's a way to find it. Someone probably has written it. It's somewhere in IBM, and we can go to GHE and look for it. So teams are seeing results. developers are seeing less process overhead and more focus on doing what they want to do, which is coding, which is great. Deployments, because we now have this automated pipeline that includes test and includes production deploy. The time to deploy new changes is going down for one of our infrastructure teams, from hours, which was typical old school manual release weekend kind of events, to 6 minutes, to 6 hours and then to minutes, now that everything is automated. The Watson team is an interesting example. People familiar with IBM Watson? And the cognitive platform, you have a lot of hands. The Jeopardy game show was brilliant as far as building awareness. But that was almost 2 years ago. And so, the day after Jeopardy, the team was formed to say, okay, take this cool technology. We're going to start building products we want to monetize. And because Watson was driven out of research, that was not something they worried about before. Because Watson was delivered out of research, memory footprint, compute requirements, architectural flexibility and how you're going to evolve that code base, globalization and internationalization, a whole bunch of things weren't thought about. So this new team inherited this set of problems with this code base with a lot of potential. And so from day one, they wanted to model what the leading cloud teams were doing. So they really started with the goal of very quick delivery cycles, delivering all the services through the cloud, through the IBM Bluemix platform, and just picked away at this code base and extracted and refactored and hardened a number of these cognitive services. I believe there are now over 30 discrete cognitive services available in Bluemix, and they all deliver on a every few weeks kind of cadence for updates. So this is reproducible in other enterprises. I guess I don't know in the audience how many people here are small company, big company. Just curious, any big company people? We'll say over 1,000 people. Okay, a few. All gravitate to the back and near the door, probably because get paged any second. But this Center of Competency learned a lot, about how to do this, and because they were trying to replicate it across IBM, they wrote it down. And what we've done is shared that on the web. And if you go to this link, you can register today for free as an attendee. You can also register tomorrow for free as a person. We're not charging for this at all. You don't actually have to register to get access. And we've broken down what we learned into 6 practice areas you can see around the outside of the wheel here, a wheel of hexagons, all centered around culture as a 7th category. And I'm going to just breeze through, some examples of this real quickly, but please do check this out on the web. So I mentioned some of the cultural things. I mentioned, de-siloing teams and fostering full sense of ownership. I mentioned executive sponsorship. I don't think I mentioned collaborative spaces, but IBM's a very distributed company. People all over the world. We've leveraged that and had very distributed teams. I know certainly in the open source community, teams are entirely distributed and are very effective at collaborating. But when I go to work every day at an IBM lab that is nominally home to 3,000 developers, and I can't find a group of more than 2 people working on the same project, the distributed thing's gotten out of hand. There's an opportunity for real-time collaboration that we're missing. So we've actually reorganized teams and swapped people around over the last year and a half to try to get more geographic cohesion amongst various squads. And then we've moved them into more collaborative workspaces. We've broken down cube walls and office walls, and we've had more of the kind of office space you'd see at GitHub, for example. I've seen their headquarters, and a lot of open space for spontaneous collaboration. The think practice area, I think, is really important, and it's not about code and it's not about technology. But at the end of the day in the enterprise, the reason for this change is you want to innovate and you want to disrupt your industry before some upstart competitor does. And so that has to start with the business. So before you embark on some project, you need to understand what you're trying to do. It's great to say, we'll build something and throw it out there, see what happens. But how are you going to see what happens? So from the very beginning, establishing what's your hypothesis, what's your minimal viable product that's going to test that hypothesis, how are you going to measure those results and learn from that? Sounds obvious, a big change, actually, for the way some teams worked. Design thinking is the other thing IBM has embraced in a big way. Everything we build has a user in mind. It might be a consumer, it might be someone in your enterprise, it might be a consumer or a programmer who's using an API you produce. But everything has a user, everything has a user experience. They're not uniformly good. And so the way we implement design thinking is upfront. We spend a lot of time identifying who the user is and establishing a persona to represent them. And then we create what we call an empathy map that describes what that user is thinking. What are they doing? They're clicking this button. They're thinking this is too many buttons. And what are they feeling? This is a dumb app. And look for ways to change how they're feeling about what they're doing, by stepping back and changing what they're doing. So we do a lot of this user design. We've established a large design practice, and that's another area where we go out and we do boot camps and we send experienced teams, not just designers, but cohesive teams of designers, product owners, developers out to work people through one of these exercises and learn how to do it. Code, I mentioned some of this. A lot of Agile, comes through here, but, doing it for real this time. Certainly bringing in things like quality and test-driven development and doing it for real this time. In delivery, I think understanding that, in some sense, the pipeline and being able to push builds through the pipeline are more important than what you actually do on the way to production. I saw this pattern many times in clients as well as in IBM, where application would have, pick a big number, 2,000 tests, 2,000 functional tests. It's great. It's not great. It's meaningless. It's meaningless because there's only one guy who can get them to work, and it's only on one machine, and his laptop is busted today. So having a place where they can run repeatably, that's visible to the whole team, where errors are visible to the whole team, I'd say is more important. I'd rather have 10 tests like that are running on every commit than I would have 2,000 tests that are fragile and sitting off in the corner somewhere. Runtimes, clearly leveraging the cloud. We now dark launch nearly every feature we do in the cloud. We then, expose it to IBMers, then to a certain set of clients, and then go live. We're starting to do more testing, in the cloud in production, some chaos testing and so on. End of the cycle is learn. What have we gathered from running the system in production that can feed back into our process and either verify our hypothesis or cause us to change it? So instrumentation is way up, both on where the users are spending time, as well as traditional kind of who's coming to the applications and so on. So that was, the methodology and the culture aspect of this. Let's talk a little bit about community. And we can see that open source has really driven a change in development communities. The stat that jumps out, I think, most to me is that less than 3% of companies don't use open source at all. This is ubiquitous. Open source is now part of everyone's platform. Different degrees, different choices, but it's ubiquitous. And more companies not only are rolling out projects based on open source, but are looking to more actively participate in the next 1 to 3 years. So I think that's exciting, and I think GitHub as a platform for doing that has been really helpful. And the successes of projects like the web and Linux and big things has really opened eyes to the power of open source. But there's free software and there's successful open source, and they're not the same thing. I think we've all seen code bases out there that don't really have a governance structure, that aren't really licensed in a way that's agreeable for enterprises to pick up, that don't really have a meritocracy where you can work your way up. It's really controlled by one vendor or one individual. Kind of liken this to, furniture left free by the side of the road. Okay, it's free, but it's not really what you want. So, to build a successful community, I think these are the 5 things to keep in mind. Responsible licensing, GPL was a noble experiment. And I think the nature of GPL was driven by the desire to keep increased participation and openness by sharing everything back. It's a great desire, but it's backfired. And it's backfired because a lot of enterprises trying to build on open source and leveraging it can't accept those terms on their extensions. So something like the Apache license, in fact, spurs more contributions and more participation because of the fact you can control what you keep private and what you're going to contribute back, and it frees you up to do more giving back at the end of the day. Having clear governance structures, is the other one I'll mention. It's great to have the code transparent, but you also want to know how decision-making is happening. If you're going to bet a product or a platform or an application on it, you need some reassurance that, again, one vendor or one individual isn't controlling the world. And there are some examples of technologies we've seen from very prominent companies doing a lot of things in open source, but things that never reach this level of maturity where there's an open governance structure with a diverse ecosystem with a number of key players. You want high participation, but you don't want it centralized. So think of something like Facebook Parse. Kind of cool. They were going to open source it. Great. People liked it. And Facebook pulled the plug, and I think it's going away. I don't think there's any legs to it left. So the community is really important. IBM has been doing this a long time. I won't go through all the projects we've participated in, but going back to the early days of Linux, IBM started contributing. And let's just talk about some of the projects we're contributing to now. So we actually have an open source group. We have several of these in IBM, and a lot of it right now is centered around cloud computing, although also around data and analytics and Internet of Things. And we're bringing serious resources to bear to make a number of foundational technologies successful. So OpenStack, the largest open source infrastructure as a service platform. Huge number of contributors. I don't know offhand the IBM number, but it's hundreds. But there are thousands working on this project. High level of activity, and we'll talk about why I think this is important in a minute. So that was the infrastructure layer. In this multi-language, multi-runtime world, kind of a pain to set up all that language runtime stuff. So Cloud Foundry emerged as a platform as a service with a variety of language runtimes. IBM has been contributing to this for, I want to say, over 2 years, both in the core and in some of the language runtimes, as a way to provide the platform of choice to each development team where they can pick the right platform for their application. IBM's working on Node. So Node's an example where the technology was great, but the infrastructure and the governance model wasn't quite there yet. And a while ago, we saw this fork of the Node code base into Node.js and IO.js. And that's a path of destruction for an open source platform sometimes because you lose critical mass. So one of the things IBM worked on was bringing that code base back together and establishing a foundation that can independently govern the Node community. Similar in data, CouchDB. IBM acquired Cloudant, which was one of the main contributors to Couch, and we're still contributing there. Spark, the list goes on. This morning, Chris mentioned Swift in the keynote, and IBM's involved in that one too. We've partnered with Apple on a number of things, and one of them has been the initiative to bring Swift to the server. So, okay, part of that's just pretty straightforward, port it to Linux, whatever. But part of that was the recognition that, okay, we got a server language now, but where's the web framework? It's great we had all the mobile APIs for the iOS apps, but if you're going to use it for something else, you really need a web presence. So IBM established Katura, which is a web framework built in Swift for Swift. Architectural patterns largely based on Express.js, but got that community bootstrapped. IBM also hosts the Swift Sandbox, so if you want to play with Swift, there's a way to do that online. You have an online editor, it runs immediately, and a fun way to get started. Little known, IBM chairs the HTML committee, was the author of CSS, jQuery, et cetera, et cetera. A number of open initiatives that aren't exactly the same as open source projects, but I'd say equally important to ensure that there's a degree of interchange amongst, for example, containers and ways to manage containers to create an opportunity for people to build on these platforms. So why does that matter to IBM? I could rattle off more and more projects, and gee, that's great, aren't we wonderful? But why does it matter? Because you'd think IBM would want to compete on, our cloud is better than your cloud. And if our cloud is built on some of the same open source as your cloud, isn't that a disadvantage? And the answer is no. Our cloud is better than a lot of clouds. And the reason it's better is it's because it's built on some of these open source platforms. So if you look at IBM Bluemix, Bluemix offers virtual machines managed by OpenStack, offers containers compatible with Docker and with an enterprise trusted registry as well as other Docker registries. It offers Cloud Foundry runtimes if you want a really low-cost way of getting your Node or Java or Ruby or Go or whatever application up and running with things like auto-scaling and dynamic memory management. Cloud Foundry is your answer. So we've got all these runtime platforms. And because these are open platforms, we were also able to deliver them in a variety of ways. So we have a public multi-tenant cloud, as everyone would expect when we say cloud. But we can also host that same stack either in a dedicated single-tenant environment in our data center, or we can host it in your data center. And I think the openness of this is part of what gives us the flexibility to do some of those things. So we've got infrastructure, we've got runtimes, we've got flexible delivery models. The other thing we have in the upper right is a service catalog. And I mentioned earlier, this is becoming the way IBM offers new capabilities to market. So instead of the big monolithic on-prem app, you're seeing things like Watson deliver very small, very contained, discrete services, published APIs, pay-as-you-go, or subscription through the Bluemix catalog. And it's not just IBM. There is a large number of third-party services available there as well. So I need to wrap pretty quickly, but I just wanted to comment about that DevOps bar on the top of the slide. When we talk to enterprises about how to be successful with cloud and digital transformation and all these themes, part of it is the learning and what are the best practices, and that's in the method. Part of it's the platform, and that's what we've brought together here, building on open source. But then part of it's on the tools. I think tools aren't everything, but tools are important. And just to practice some of what we've preached here, we have a hypothesis we want to test. And the hypothesis is, this is beyond hypothesis, we know teams want best-of-breed tools, and that not every team is going to want the same thing. But we also know when you try to repeat that across the enterprise, just buying the tools, licensing them, provisioning your users, integrating them together, getting the right plugins in the right places is cumbersome. And then trying to figure out what they're all trying to tell you is difficult as well. So we established 3 personas. The developer just wants, where are my tools? I just joined a new squad this week. Where's our GitHub repo? Where do we keep issues? Where's our plan? What are our latest test results? Just find the stuff. The team lead wants to be able to add tools as the team grows, as the team's needs change, but isn't a full-time toolsmith. We used to have those in some enterprises. They're gone now. So it needs an easy way to do that. And then Caroline, who's sponsoring the executive sponsoring the transformation, wants to be able to pick those practices and tool chains that are working and stamp them out across multiple teams. So coming to Bluemix, and this is something you can go check out now, is this idea of tool chains as first-class objects that let you establish for a team, here's the set of tools we're using. This will automate some of the integration. It'll automate the provisioning of users. And it's a platform on which you can build, and we are building analytics to try to derive meaning from all these tools. For the enterprise transformation aspect, it makes these tool chains templatized so that you can stamp them out again and again for teams with similar needs. Part of the tool chain initiative was partnering with GitHub. So in February, we announced that IBM is going to offer GitHub Enterprise, so single-tenant private solution for enterprises that want that, but hosted and managed by IBM in the IBM cloud for teams that don't want to run their own infrastructure and become GitHub admins. So this is the first example where we're trying to bring those best-of-breed tools into the IBM Cloud Platform as a first-class part of the platform and make them available to our enterprise clients. So for innovation, you need the method, and check out the Garage method. Engage in communities, and there are a number of cloud foundational communities we think are very critical to enabling innovation that we're working with, and then a platform that brings it all together, and that's IBM Bluemix. So you can check these things out. If you want to read, look at the method. If you want to code, look at Bluemix. You'll find the Swift sandbox there. And I almost got us back on time. Thanks very much.